Since it is 9:30,
Yes.
and I know you're extremely punctual, so I would like to take this opportunity, first of all, to welcome you on behalf of the faculty and the students here from AIMSR. So I'll briefly introduce you before handing over the charge to you to take the session.
Sure.
This is for the benefit of all those who are there as attendees. Mr. Piyush Chitlangia is the founder of FinShiksha, an alumnus of IIM Calcutta and MNIT Jaipur. Mr. Piyush has been in the financial services industry for the last 15 years and has extensive exposure to equity research, investment analysis, and financial modeling, along with training. Mr. Piyush is also a CFA charter holder. Prior to FinShiksha, he worked as an equity analyst and fund manager at Allegro Capital Advisors. Post starting FinShiksha, he has trained nearly 15,000 participants across organizations such as Aditya Birla Group, Nippon India Mutual Fund, Kotak Securities, Motilal Oswal, CRISIL, JP Morgan, Dr. Reddy's, among others, and the top MBA institutes in India. His core areas of interest are valuation, derivatives, macroeconomics, and financial markets. I met him a couple of years ago, and at that time, I think the most important agenda that we used to discuss was about training the youngsters so that they could become more employable, particularly with a comprehensive knowledge and understanding of macroeconomics and finance. So I'm extremely honored to present before you Mr. Piyush Chitlangia, who is going to walk you through macroeconomics, understanding implications in the post-corona world. So thank you so much, Piyush, for joining us.
Thank you, ma'am, for having me here. Good morning to all the students as well and the faculty members also who are joining this. Thanks for having me, ma'am. I appreciate the gesture and always good to connect with students. I believe with this batch, I have had one interaction earlier as well when I was at the campus last year. Right? I think that was the beginning of this particular batch when I was there for a small
Yes,
talk. Yeah. So
that's right.
I'm
Absolutely.
assuming some of them do remember me.
Yeah.
And, so that's broadly it. I will not take too much time and probably just dive into the discussion right away. And, I'm assuming there is some discussion time left at the end for some Q&A in which case students can ask any kind of queries or questions that they have,
And
right?
if you want, yeah, it can also be made interactive. So it's up to you. You can decide.
I think it'll be easier if I first discuss the major topics that I have at hand, and then we can probably get the students to ask questions towards the later part, if that works fine,
Perfect. Yeah, yeah, perfect.
right? So just give me a second. I'll just share my screen, and then we should be good to go. 1 second, huh? Do we see this?
Yeah.
We're
Yes.
able to see the presentation in the presentation format as well.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Um, I don't know, for some reason it doesn't show me my webcam. I'm assuming that is also visible at the student's end.
Yes, we can see you also.
Okay, perfect. All right. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session where we're going to discuss about macroeconomics and its implications in the post-corona world. And how does this sort of impact us with respect to our overall viewpoint in terms of how does Indian economy basically get out of it. Now I think enough has been talked about corona in terms of its broader impact, so I'll not go there. I'll focus on broadly 2 or 3 major aspects of looking at it from the perspective of policy making that Government of India is trying to do at this point of time, and inferences on what's happening around us with respect to a certain set of events, right? So we'll broadly focus on those aspects of it as we go along. Now, the key construct around that, before we go there, I'll just quickly, we as a standard process, we kind of run a small disclaimer. So the contents have been prepared by FinShiksha by using publicly available sources. It does not imply any recommendation to buy or sell any asset classes or securities. It might consist of opinions as mentioned by the FinShiksha team, right? And independent veracity of the information has not been established. It's we are relying on whatever information is available on various government websites around us, right? About FinShiksha, FinShiksha is a company that I started. It specializes in education in the financial services domain. We are more than just a pure e-learning provider. We are big in e-learning, but our idea is to create something that is beyond just education providing. We do a lot of hand-holding of people and guiding of people who enroll for our courses. Courses have been built and kept practical with that in mind, and that's the broader idea of what we have been kind of building. So we are one of the larger players in the MBA segment across India, and that basically has helped us kind of train more than 40,000 people across companies and campuses, interacted with them over the last 5-7 years. We have a YouTube channel, which might help some of you guys who are in finance. You could just go and search for FinShiksha on YouTube and you'll find that. And we have we have a reach across campuses like yours, and we kind of keep conducting some of these awareness workshops as well, right? Ma'am has already given an introduction about me, so I'll skip this part. We'll start with our discussion with respect to the GDP. Just give me one more moment. When we look at the national output, broadly, we're going to look at 3 aspects of macro today. We're going to look at what's the impact on GDP. We're going to look at what's the impact on our employment data. And we are going to look at what is the impact on our fiscal scenario. What is the fiscal scenario? What are the government finances basically? So we're going to look at these 3 aspects of what Corona does to us. I'll obviously just take the liberty of digging a little bit into concepts as well, so that all of us are at the same page. So it'll become sort of a session plus a class in that context. So bear with me if some of us already understand these concepts, but at least with GDP and fiscal scenario, I'll probably have to explain a little bit how the mechanics work broadly. Right. So let's first understand the GDP scenario. India's GDP growth keeps getting touted at various levels. There is a number called real GDP growth, and there's a number called nominal GDP growth. Can someone tell me what is total GDP size of India, if I may ask? And you can unmute yourself and tell me. What is the total GDP size of India? Anyone?
It's around dollar 2 point something trillion plus, about 2 point trillion something.
Okay, so Indian GDP is approximately equal to USD 2.7 trillion, right? If you convert that to rupees, it will become nearly about 2 crore approximately at an exchange rate of about 75 to a dollar, right? What is India's GDP growth rate? And don't give the recent number, but probably what do you think is the average of the last 5-7 years? Anyone? India's GDP growth rate over the last few years.
6.8%.
So somewhere about, let's say 6 to 7%. Question from my end. Is this real growth rate or is this nominal growth rate? Anyone who's interested in economics, is this
Nominal.
17.
Sorry?
Nominal.
Anyone else? Someone else also said something. Is this real or nominal? So we hear nominal as the answer. Now let's understand the mechanics of nominal and real first, and then we'll understand what it is in itself, right? So nominal data is expressed in terms of current price, right? Real data is expressed in terms of prices of a base year, and it adjusts for inflation every year. Let's understand the reason behind why we have nominal numbers and real numbers, and then I'll explain the broader concept. Let's assume there is a hypothetical country who produces, let's say, kgs of steel, argument's sake, right? And I don't know what the steel price is, but let's say argument's sake, the steel price is 25 rupees a kg. And it produces only this. There's nothing else that is produced. So in the year 2000, the total output of the country is 100 kg into 25 bucks. That is 2,500 rupees, right? Straight multiplication of volume with the price gives you the nominal value, the current value. Now you keep doing that every year. 103 into 26, you get 2678 and so on and so forth. Now let's focus our attention on the years 2002 and 2003, right? In these years, you will see that the growth rate of the country, nominal GDP, is 13.2%. GDP grows from 2940 to 3328, correct? That's a good growth rate, right? But if you look at the actual output in terms of volume, that's gone down, right? You're producing less steel than what you were producing last year. Now, if this country's population is growing, that's a problem. Correct? Why is that a problem? Is because per capita output has declined essentially. So what is causing this increase? The price change is causing this increase. Now this price change is a slightly tricky calculation, because when you're calculating the GDP growth, what is GDP? GDP is gross domestic product, right? So you want to look at the production numbers. You are worried about the output numbers. The price can distort it. Now think of a country that produces a lot of oil. Last year oil prices were about $60. In between they went to $20. Now they are at $40. If you calculate GDP in actual current price terms, this could be a big problem in terms of how do you look at the actual GDP. The country's output may not have changed at all, but the nominal value of GDP will keep changing dramatically. So what we do is we tend to remove the price from the equation, right? Now, if I was to find only the difference between these production numbers, those values will come here, and you will see in 2013, the production actually fell by 1%. This is the real output growth, right? Now, this is a simplistic example. Let's assume there is a country that produces computers and that produces, let's say, water bottles, right? I'm producing two of these things, computers and water bottles. Let's say first year 100 computers and 100 water bottles, second year 103 computers and 105 water bottles. This is 3%, this is 5% growth in production terms. Now what do I take as the GDP growth? Obviously there is a problem. I can't take 3% because that will ignore water bottles. I can't take 5 because that will ignore computers. I can't take a simple average because the value of computers would be very large as compared to water bottles, right? So I need to take a weighted average. Weighted average will have to weight it by price, but price was causing a distortion. So I had removed the price, right? Now understand that when we are calculating GDP numbers, the price is not causing the distortion. The change in price is causing the distortion. So I have to take care of the change in price. What is change in price? Inflation, essentially, right? So how about us fixing the price at a particular year and then multiplying each year's output with that year? So that's what gets you this column, right? Now, in a simplistic example, it is not required because that's only one commodity you're producing. But if there are multiple commodities, then the way you look at it is 100 computers into, let's say, 50K, that is the price of the computer, plus 100 water bottles into, let's say, 50 rupees, that's the price of the water bottle. That's my output. Next year, my output will be 103 into 50,000. I will fix the price, right? And 105 into 50. This year where the price is fixed is called the base year, right? It's called the base year. India has, I think, 2011-12 as the base year at this point of time. So if you look at the GDP report of Government of India, they come up with two estimates. There is something that is called as GDP at market prices or current prices. And there is something that is called as GDP at constant prices. Constant is real, market or current is nominal. We are more concerned about what's happening in real output terms. So when we talk about this growth number, this is always real growth, right? Now, keep that in mind. It's not nominal number, it's real number. Let's look at, I'll just rub this, erase all of this. And if you look at this year and this year, you will see the volume changes by 3%. That's captured here. The price changes by approximately 4%. So that's, if you see the difference of nominal and real, you can calculate nominal is equals to real plus inflation. That's a simplistic calculation. The exact calculation works on compounding. So 1 plus real into 1 plus inflation is equals to 1 plus nominal growth rate. But for all practical purposes, you can do that. So if India's real GDP growth rate is about 6% and India's inflation is about 4%, in nominal terms, the GDP should be growing at 10%, right? Which basically means that this number of USD 2.7 trillion is growing at 10%, 10 to 12% actually, because that's the absolute GDP, nominal GDP in current prices terms. Clear? So far, so good. So we are looking at a real GDP growth of, whatever 6-7% historically in the last 5-6 years. We are looking at a nominal GDP growth of approximately 10 to 12% for India because inflation has been between 4-5-6%. We are more worried about real GDP growth because nominal tends to move a lot with prices. But all calculations that happen on absolute GDP data, right, $2.7 trillion, are talking about nominal GDP numbers. So we'll come back to this when we talk about fiscal finances. But that's broadly GDP. Now, what is GDP? It's the sum total of all economic activity within a country, geographical boundaries of a country. It includes economic activity by a foreign entity in the country, right? How do you calculate GDP? There are three broad ways to calculate GDP. You could measure the entire output of the country. You could measure the entire consumption of the country. You could measure the cumulative income of every person in the country. There are three broad ways to do this. So either find out what is the total final output, right? Either find out what is the total final consumption or find out what is the income of everyone. I'll give you a simple example. Let's assume there is an orange farmer, there is an orange juice maker, and there is a consumer, right? Farmer, juice maker, and consumer. The orange farmer sells oranges worth $1,000 to the juice maker. The orange juice maker makes juice glasses worth $1,500 and sells it to consumers, right? What is the entire output? Now, when you take the output, you take the final output, right? So output is equal to 1,500 worth of glasses of juice. Consumption is also equal to 1,500. That's the final consumption, right? Intermediate consumption like oranges is not considered here. So when you calculate this, if you're assuming that India produced 10 cars, those cars include the prices of the wheels that were put into that, right? So you don't double count that. You only take the final consumption. And if you look at income, assuming there's no cost of growing all of this, income for the farmer is 1,000 and income for the juice maker is 1,500 minus 1,000. That's 500. So that's again 1,500. So in a simple scenario, use any method, it would come to a similar conclusion. In real life, obviously, that becomes difficult because you have to sample for this data. You can't go and ask everyone what is the consumption you've done or what is the actual output that you've produced, especially when economies go into services, right? I mean, it's very difficult to find out how much a cab driver earned over a period of time, unless there is a clear reporting of that data. So there are sampling estimates that are taken care of. You can obviously measure the output of the corporate world, and you can measure the consumption of whatever is recorded on a taxable front, but a lot of the consumption may not necessarily be recorded, right? That still has a economic value. So technically this is used by sampling, and obviously there are errors that come into that process. So if you look at the GDP report, Government of India comes with both these methods, and there is generally a discrepancy that comes as well in both the methods. The actual number doesn't add up to the same value, right? But let's for a minute assume that we're looking at the consumption method to kind of look at it, right? This is the most intuitive method to look at GDP. Look at the consumption method of GDP calculation, right? Now, any consumption that is done in the economy can be done broadly by three entities, right? If there is a sale that has happened and someone has purchased it or consumed it, that can be done by three entities. Either the government must have done it, or individuals like you and me, private consumption might have happened, or businesses might have used it for some kind of investment. There are only three entities that can consume anything that is sold in the country, either the government or the consumer or people, people like you and me, or businesses. There is no fourth entity. Every sale has to happen to one of these three entities, right? However, remember, we are looking at product. So there is something that is produced in the country but not consumed in the country. What is that? Exports. So you add exports to this. There is also something that is consumed in the country but was not produced in the country, right? For example, if let's say I buy a water bottle for 150 bucks, and this is an imported water bottle where the importer actually paid 100 bucks, the value added in India is only 50, but my consumption here would have accounted for 150. So I need to subtract the 100, which is why I subtract imports from here. So the equation of GDP becomes G plus C plus I plus X minus M. I will put this as X minus M combined. That's exports minus imports, or net exports that we have. That's the equation that you would look at when you're looking at gross domestic product. It's a simple yet extremely powerful equation. If you look at this, you can actually come up with a broader understanding of how is the economy going to grow. Right? I'll give you an example. We are in a post-corona world. So look at the categories of calculations, right? People are sitting at home. Obviously, they're not going out. If they're not going out, they're not going to consume. Obviously, businesses are suffering. Salaries are down. So in a sense, the consumption is going to go down. Correct? So that takes care of consumption. There's no way this can increase sitting at home on an aggregate basis. Some commodities or some services like, let's say, media might increase, but textiles will suffer, right? Automobiles will suffer, fuel will suffer, because we are not going out. We're not going to go and buy stuff, right? In this environment where demand doesn't exist, what do you think businesses will do? Will they expand capacity, or will they sit till the time things resolve? So that's fairly logical. People around us would kind of vouch for that. Investment is also down, right? Now, worldwide, there are two phenomena that are taking place. Problem one is that there is no travel, right? People are skeptical of allowing goods and services from other countries to your place. Plus, there is generally a movement across the world, which is like looking inwards, right? We've had a big globalization run over the last 50, 60, 70 years. Now, most countries are saying, okay, let's look a little bit inward and try and help internally produce some stuff, right? What is that doing? X minus M is also kind of going down. Global trade will suffer for the same very reasons that consumption and investment is down. Now, if you want your GDP to stay stable or grow, there is only one option left, which is for the government to spend. Right? The government has to spend. There is no other way that your GDP grows. And if the government can't spend because they don't have the funds to spend, then we are nothing but staring at a GDP decline in this year. There is no way our GDP can grow unless these arrows are reversed in some form or fashion, right? The other thing we need to note is in India, India is a consumption driven economy. So this C is approximately 60% of our GDP equation, right? In any economy, the government probably needs to be a small part of the economy. This is about 12% or something. Based on the data they release, the exact classification obviously changes. Industry is about 30%, and this number is approximately -2 to 3%, right? I'm just rounding off them a little bit, and data changes year to year, but approximately that's the average we've held over the last few years, right? So if consumption is going down and investment is going down, it is very difficult for the government to pull GDP up. I mean, if consumption falls by 10%, that's a -6% number, 60 going to 54, right? So how will you grow the GDP? The government will have to spend by an extra 60%. They don't have those funds. So that basically creates a challenge in terms of how the GDP can grow, right? Take one step back. I'll look at the same equation, G plus C plus I plus X minus M. If you think about the corporate tax cut that happened, right? If you think about the corporate tax cut that happened, in that what happened was the government said, okay, we have to spend money. The government collects taxes and then spends money, so G increases. In this particular case, the government said, okay, we'll reduce taxes, so our spending doesn't go up, but we give that money to businesses whose spending can go up. Businesses are better utilizers of capital. Efficient utilization of capital happens if a business uses it, because that's not government's purpose, right? So logically, in a corporate tax cut, the government transferred some of the resources that they were spending from their hands to the businesses so that the businesses could spend. And that's why the news was taken extremely positively by the stock markets, right? Now, in a post-corona world, almost everywhere in the world, the GDP is going to decline for this financial year. In fact, the word GDP itself is expected to contract this financial year. This particular quarter that just went by, Q1 in India financial year and Q2 for the calendar year across the world, is a complete washout. So practically the numbers we see are close to -20 to -30% annualized GDP growth rates for that quarter. Obviously it will bounce back, and in this quarter and next quarter we are likely to see a bounce. But do remember that this could be there could be some time it takes before GDP revives in that context, right? So that's the broader impact on the GDP of the world. Let's quickly look at where we are. We are around 2.7 trillion. In fact, now this year we have gone here. This data is as of last year. So if you look at this year data, we are at about close to 2.9 trillion or so. And so we are the 5th largest economy in the world. In about 6-7 years from now, we should be the 3rd largest economy of the world, somewhere here. That's a good thing. Obviously, on per capita basis, there is a lot more that can be done, but this is essentially where we are, and our GDP continues to grow at a reasonable pace when compared to the rest of the world. Only in large economies, the only economy that can look at our kind of growth is China and Indonesia. We are in nominal terms expected to grow at 10%. Obviously, some of these expectations were before coronavirus happened. So obviously this year is a washout, and that creates some set of problems for India. We'll talk about them as we go along. So far, so good. So that's our GDP numbers. That's what we are doing in terms of the GDP growth. And globally, there's no other way to look at it but say that, GDP growth is going to suffer. Growth will dip in FY21. We have to see how quickly it rebounds in FY22, because there are behavioral changes that might have come if you keep people locked down for too long, right? In the lockdown, you remember that, one of the key things in economics that's in a way funny is almost all economic growth happens when people consume things that they don't necessarily need, right? If you were looking at only need-based consumption, then I think we were actually fine with barter system, right? But because you go and consume things that are not necessarily needed but more wanted, that's where consumerism comes in, and that's where growth comes in. So, for example, I could go and buy 20 t-shirts. I might not need them, but the economic engine runs because I keep buying them, right? There is a positive impact of consumerism that plays out. If you keep people locked in their homes for 6 months, then it's possible that the consumerism itself starts getting impacted mentally, that behaviorally people change, that why should I go out and purchase something. Now, to a certain extent, the non-discretionary items will just change the way they are consumed or the distribution channel. So if I went to a grocery store earlier, I'll probably opt for an online delivery now, right? The distribution networks will change there. But for certain items, the entire consumption pattern could change, right? I may not, feel comfortable going to PVR cinemas at all over the next 1 year, right? I may not visit a mall for the next 3 to 6 months, right? Eating out could be a change of pattern. Restaurants could move from dine in towards take home. Already we are seeing some of these changes playing out, right? Companies could go towards work from home from where they are right now. So what that does is basically commercial real estate could get impacted because of that. You don't need as much space. You could release some of that space. Populations that are areas that are densely populated could become lesser densely populated because population starts moving out. Think of a city like Mumbai, right? Extremely densely populated. People travel a lot every day to attend, their work. But if work from home becomes the normal, companies find a way around it. You could have a lot more changing in that context, and that could have a positive and a negative impact on GDP, because once you go out, you kind of do a lot of things that you would otherwise not do, and that may be positive or negative in the aggregate level for the GDP, right? So you have to think of these aspects as we go along. We're not clear what will follow and how quickly we'll get out of this, but let's see how this plays out, right? Which brings us to the second topic of the day, which is population demographics and employment, right? If you look at India's GDP, and I'll take round figures for now, India's GDP is $3 trillion, which converted to billion is about $300 billion, right? Approximate population of India is about 1.33 billion, right? Or 1.3 billion, let's round it off, which means per capita GDP is approximately, what, 2,400 or 500 odd dollars, 2,300 to $400, right? That's the per capita income of a person in India. About 1.5 lakh rupees per annum is the average income of someone residing in India. Obviously, this gets adjusted when you're comparing to other companies, because the value of $1 in India could be different than the value of $1 in the US. But basically, our population has historically been the reason why we have not progressed fast, because we're a large population country, right? There are some interesting insights into that as well. However, we keep hearing about India's population being young, right? Let's understand what is the premise of that, and look at this in a totality of the picture. So we're going to look at two things. One is what is the demographic profile, and second, what is the employment profile of this population, right? And that will give us a clearer picture as to where are we headed, right? So let's first look at the demographic profile. These are the top 25 countries of the world sorted on the basis of their expected populations in 2050, right? So no surprises, we will be at the top, which we are kind of clear about at this point itself. These numbers are slightly old, so there could have been some revisions here, but it'll give an idea broadly, right? There are a few interesting things here. First thing is, if you look at India and China put together, at all points of time, these two countries basically form 1/3 of the world, right? So these are like, in terms of population and consumption, these are like powerhouses. You don't need a word to keep running the consumption engine in these countries. We live in a globalized world, so obviously things get produced somewhere else. But a lot of the sectors can actually just be looking inwards and be happy with the demand they get in India, just because of the sheer size of the population that we have, right? You also see, interestingly, there are some countries where you see these red numbers, right? When you see these red numbers, these are where you see a decline. Which are these countries? I have marked Germany, I have marked Japan, Russia, and China. China, we all know, used to have a one-child policy, and that obviously over a long period of time will curtail your total population growth. and they've realized that could be a problem. Why is that a problem? We'll come to that in a minute, right? Japan sees that declining population. Russia sees that declining population. Now, population can decline because of two reasons. One is you have migration that can be happening, right, out of the country. China, Japan, Russia, Germany, almost all of them are well-to-do countries. So that doesn't hold water. People shouldn't be migrating out of these countries. That doesn't make sense, right? So the only other population decline reason is aging population. You have a bigger proportion of older population as compared to younger people. Your death rate in the country is higher than the birth rate. So the population starts declining. Now, in an aging population, things become problematic for a variety of reasons. One, as the population matures, consumption patterns change. You know, if a new model of a car is launched or an iPhone is launched, a 30-year-old person is more likely to get excited than a 60-year-old person. You know, broadly generalizing. There's no clear idea of generalizing it. You could always have exceptions, but if you take a sample of 100 people in the age group of 30 and a sample of 100 people in the age group of 60, the consumption patterns will be vastly different. At the age of 60, consumption patterns move towards more non-discretionary items like FMCG, retail, healthcare, etc. Right? At the age of 30, it's more discretionary items because you feel that there's more time left, and you could save more at a later point as well. And that basically is the crux of an aging population. So consumption kind of gets skewed in certain sectors. That's problem one. Second is when, let's say, 60 is the retirement age. So at the age of 59, you are a source of income to the government because you pay taxes. At the age of 61, you are the source of expense to the government because you get a pension. You're on government support now in at least most of the major sort of developed economies, right? Now that has a huge implication as well, because the government finances could get stretched if you have a big aging population that's kind of moving towards sort of retirement, right? In fact, in 2009, when the world was in global crisis, Greece did something interesting. They didn't have the money, right? They'd borrowed a lot and didn't have money to repay. So they launched what is called as an austerity program, where the government controls its spending. To control its spending, what the government did was they actually increased the retirement age. Right? The retirement age was increased from 60 to 65. So if someone was retiring in 2009, they were told that, look, to get benefits, you have to work for another 5 years. You can only retire in 2014. So that's just an example of how governments get impacted by aging populations and what could be a problem in terms of government spending, right? That results in a variety of policy frameworks that kind of change, that also, kind of create an interesting setup for countries like India. Now, there are two other things that we need to look at here. One is look at the top 10 countries here. And with the exception of a US, everything else is an emerging or underdeveloped country. That's sort of counterintuitive that you should have lower populations in these countries, but you have the highest population expanse in these countries. And maybe there's a cause and effect there, that because you have the highest population is why these countries are not necessarily well-to-do or emerging or underdeveloped, right? There is a way to kind of address this. If you leave out US, which is the world's largest economy, almost everything else, at least historically, used to be a labor-driven economy. It probably continues to be, right? Unlike the developed market, which is more now a knowledge-driven economy. A labor-driven economy, manually specifically, if you're manual labor, is linear in nature. Think about it. If you have agriculture and you have land, what one person can produce, two people can produce twice of that. That's your society way of thinking in labor-intensive economies, right? In knowledge-intensive economies, on the other hand, things are non-linear. What one person can achieve using a computer, two people can actually achieve significantly more using a computer, right? So inherently, your society believes that more hands or more population will mean prosperity, which is sort of counterintuitive because that creates a problem in the longer run, right? So that's why all labor intensive economies historically have had a bigger population number, and all knowledge or non-linear economies have started kind of moving towards a setup where the economic growth has kind of moved to a non-linear format, and yet population growth has not kind of exploded there, right? So that's in a nature of how things kind of play out. Of course, other factors also play out, like what's happening with healthcare. Is your primary healthcare infrastructure improving or not improving? That has a big impact in this as well, right? So that's the sort of negative part around it. Now with us, there's another interesting phenomenon that plays out, that we don't have any problem of aging population. We are actually a young population. Our median age, if I'm not wrong, is approximately 28 years. Right now, that same number for Japan is about 45 years, right? So you could look at the difference there. To understand our population demographics better, you could look at some more details here, right? So focus on the right side of this chart. This gives India's population by the age group. So I've decoded and taken it from The Economist, and let's draw two horizontal lines here. So I'll draw one horizontal line here, and I'll draw one horizontal line here. Below 15 years and above 60 years. This here is the working age defined by law, 15 to 60, right? What you see as the horizontal bars is 2015 population distribution in India, and what you see as vertical lines is 2050 expected distribution. So let's look at 2015 and let's look at the population. If you look at the age group of 0 to 15, you're approximately looking at 30% of your population there. If you look at 15 to 60 and greater than 60, you're probably looking at 60% there, and greater than 60 is approximately equal to 10%. In 2050, if you go to 2050, these numbers change slightly. So let me write those in a different ink. This becomes 20%. This also becomes 20%. You'll see there is a widening of these lines here, right? But you add up, they'll be about 20%, which basically means that this still remains 60%. So between 2015 and 2050, working age population for India is always 60%. 60% of India can work because they are in that age group. Now make no mistake, that doesn't mean they're working. What I'm saying is they can work, right? That's a big advantage in itself. If you can provide jobs to these people, they can keep earning money and they can keep consuming. And consumption boom is huge in India if you think about the level of penetration of certain industries. I'll give you examples as we go along, but that's your population pyramid. Again, 2020 pyramid, and you see there's a huge bulge that comes here on both the male and female population. And that's basically your age group between 10 and probably 40, 45. And so the next 2 or 3 decades, you are going to have a substantial sort of, play that is going to work out, which is, if you see populations age 15 to 64 as a percentage of total, and you go all the way up to 2050, that number stays north of 60%, right? That red line I've drawn is 60%, and above that is what it stays all the time. Right? We need to provide them jobs. That's the key. Now let's look at the good part about this story. The good part is I'll give you examples. India, for example, has, let's actually go to this slide here. Right? I'll come to this in a minute. India's population is 130 crore. Right? That would approximately mean 25 crore households. Right, approximately 25 crore households, assuming 5 people in a household, broadly. Right now, if you look at 25 crore households and you look at the distribution of things as per households in terms of how much is housing availability per household, how much is cars availability per household, and when you compare some of these statistics to the world, there is a big difference. We have a 130 crore population, and yet airline domestic passengers in a year are close to 15 crore, right? That's about 0.12 seats per capita, right? This number for almost the entire emerging market, which includes Southeast Asia kind of countries as well, entire emerging markets is 0.4, which means if they had the population of 130 crore, they would be flying 60 crore people every year. Right? For the developed world, this number is more than 1, which means if they have 130 crore of population, they'll be flying 130 crore people every year. We are flying a minuscule proportion. In fact, this 15 crore would be like the same user goes and flies again and again. If you find unique people flying, that will not be more than 2 crore, right? On a population of 130 crore, imagine the extent of growth that can happen. Hospital beds in India are 9 per 10,000 population, right? World average is approximately 30, and that's the average, right? So things can improve dramatically there. If you look at demat accounts in India, people who trade and open broking accounts, that's like about approximately 3 crore, right? 3 crore demat accounts in India. I think 1/3 of these are inactive. People open it because they wanted an IPO to be applied at and then never used it again. So 2 crore. You go to 2 crore. Almost everyone who is in the markets on average has more than one account, right? So when you go to unique numbers, that will probably become 1.2, 1.3 crore. I have 3 demat accounts, for example. I could be an outlier here because they have been opened at various points and they've never been closed. That's a different issue. Some of them might come under inactive, etc. But people will have more than one demat accounts if they open it with multiple broking houses, right? Then you go further and see in terms of households. If a household has understanding of financial markets, it's likely that everyone in the household has an account, right? So when you break it down to actual number of households that have demat accounts, that number probably goes down to about 0.5 crore households, right? Assuming that on average, each household will have 2 to 3 demat accounts. So people having demat accounts. So you go to about 0.5 crore households. 0.5 crore households have demat accounts in India versus 25 crore households. Now, I'm not saying 25 crore can have demat accounts at this stage because we are not a prosperous country, but 10% of that can have a demat account, right? The top 10% of India can have a demat account. That's 2.5 crore. 2.5 crore households can have a demat account. And today we are at 0.5 crore. That's why the broking industry is growing. That's why so many discount brokers are coming into the picture. The same example is with mutual fund penetration. Anything, you take a penetration of cars. Cars are at 32 cars per 1,000 population, right? This number in China is 80. This number worldwide, obviously population density plays a role here, but developed markets is 300 to 400, right? So there's a huge scope of growth over a period of time in a lot of industries in India. Steel consumption in India, right, is about 50 kg per capita. This number in the world average is about 240 kg. China is at 480 kg, right? So just in terms of sheer consumption, this population gives a huge advantage. Now there is a big problem, however, that India is not a single country essentially, right? If you look at it in terms of our distribution, there are sort of 3 Indias that you can create: India 1, India 2, and India 3, right? And you could look at the distribution in the sense that the top 6% of the workforce or the top 2 crore households earn approximately, per capita income is $8,000, $8,800. Household population is about 11 crore people. This population is your top of the pyramid in terms of the income distribution, right? A lot of the countries operate only here. You go to India 2, right? That's about 29 million working members. Population is similar. That's the next chunk of the population, which is the middle class that comes in, right? So this is your middle class, which is India 2, right? Bulk of India, however, is in India 3, which is about 460 million or 46 crore working members. Total households 23 crore. Population 112 crore. Per capita income very low. And you can actually look at this in terms of various countries. This India is similar to Mexico. This India is similar to Philippines. This India is similar to Sub-Saharan African. If you take 100 Indians, the distribution looks something like this. The top one guy earns 30% of the total and makes 1.5 lakhs a month. The next 14 earn 30% of the total and make 20,000 a month. Then that's 15, right? The next 30 make 30% of the total and 8,000 a month. And the poorest 55 earn 10% of the total and make only 1,500 per month each, right? So this distribution is very stark. Obviously, it's moving upward, so things are improving, but they're not improving as quickly as you would want. And bulk of what we come across in terms of online stuff and e-commerce tackles this, and at best this. This is typically catered to by the government. Also, bulk of this workforce, which is 80% of the workforce, 88%, is in informal activity, right? India's total workforce is approximately 50 crore. Half of that is deployed in agriculture, right? So out of 50 crore approximate numbers, nearly 25 crore are in agriculture, right? Out of the remaining 25, nearly 80% is informal labor, right? Working in provision stores or people who are deployed in construction activities. India's formal workforce out of 50 crore is not more than 5 crore, right? So we are looking at a workforce, informal workforce, that is nearly, to the tune of about 20 crore people out of this 25 crore. And that got impacted by coronavirus, right? So look at this on the right side. There are 260 million people employed in India's non-farm sector. Agriculture employs around 20 million as per this, 200 million. So you're looking at about 26 crore people in non-farm, and 83% of the non-farm sector is informal sector, which means you're looking at about 83% of this, which would work out to something like 22 crore people are informal workforce. And informal workforce was the worst hit because you just shut down everything. And you had to shut down things because globally there was a problem and a scare. So if you shut down a manufacturing unit, obviously the company can, the SMEs can, let's say, absorb this for a couple of months. But beyond that, it's a working capital scenario. I mean, think of a retail store, right? Everything is a fixed cost. Think of a hotel, everything is a fixed cost. You are running inventories. You don't have any footfalls or income that is going to happen. Till how long will you pay salaries? And it's not like extremely profitable business. I mean, the only profitable retailer in India is DMart. And they make about 4% net margin. On 100 rupees of sales, they make 4 rupees of profit. A cost is fixed to a large extent, right? So how do you get out of that problem? And that basically put nearly about 13 million jobs at risk. Now, this is an old estimate of March, April. Obviously, things have changed a bit, so we have to wait for some time to see what that impact is. But if we are not able to restart the economy quickly, there is a problem in terms of a lot of these jobs being at risk. Jobs being at risk create two problems. Problem one is if I go back to my GDP equation, your consumption is going to be in trouble. You can't do anything about it, right? And if people are not getting jobs, they're not earning, they're not going to spend, they're going to save more. Also, what happens is we could argue that it's only a 1 quarter problem. But the challenge with that is if there was someone who was earning 100 and was saving 25 or spending 25 out of it, this year, this person is only earning 75, best case. So your entire discretionary consumption possibility goes for a toss. Plus, given what has happened, people would have used their savings. So you will take a few more years to actually get out of that. So it's not so easy to just restart consumption. What we see as restarting consumption is typically India 1 and a part of India 2. India 3 will take a lot of time to get restarted unless you kind of move very quickly on the up move. And that causes a little bit of a challenge, right? Obviously, when you read in media, you see both extremes of things. You see, things like are very dire and things are, improving very quickly. But the story or the reality lies somewhere in between. You have to keep this in mind that India is not just a very homogeneous kind of a thing where you take a policy and, it goes and impacts everyone equally the same. It may not, right? So it is a little bit of a challenge. The other issue we face is a large young unemployed population can be a problem, right? Till the time people are employed, they have bigger things to worry about. They keep focused on work and that goes on. Globally, wherever you have had high unemployed population, there are other issues like, sort of social unrest, etc., that start cropping in, and that becomes a problem as well, right? So what plays in your benefit obviously becomes a weakness as well. And our population has long been our weakness and our strength. We need to ensure that we create enough jobs in the formal sector. For that, MSME network in India needs to be improved dramatically because bulk of the workforce, especially the informal workforce, works there. For that, all your new age startups need to be encouraged a lot more because those are the guys who are generating jobs, right? And that's where policy making has to focus on. Clear? So that's my discussion on this. Let's move quickly to India's fiscal policy. Now, fiscal policy, again, I'll take about 2 minutes to understand and explain what is fiscal policy. This is government's policy of spending, right? Now, if you think about it, the government gets certain revenues and it does certain expenditure. People like you and me have a budget that gets created like income minus expenses is equal to savings. The government's budget doesn't go by that way because that's not their idea of being in existence. They don't have to create savings. So the government works the other way. They find out what is the expenditure, then they find out what is the income, and if there is a shortfall, there is going to be a borrowing, right? This is what is commonly called as a fiscal deficit, the term we keep reading about, right? That's what is called as fiscal deficit, right? I'll not bore you with too much numbers here because obviously there is a lot of numbers that can come in, but the source of revenues for the government could be in the form of taxes. Taxes could be both direct and indirect. Direct taxes are taxes on income. So income tax and corporate tax is direct tax. Indirect taxes can be looked as taxes on transaction. So GST is a indirect tax. Excise duty, VAT, sales tax, etc. are indirect taxes because they're happening on consumption or transaction that is happening, right? Government could make money by selling its stake in companies, and government could make money by getting dividends from RBI or other entities that they have. Expenditure is broken down into two parts. There is something called as capital expenditure. That is something that makes an asset for the government. Anything that creates an asset for the government is a capital expenditure. So if the government goes and spends on a road or a infrastructure project or a port, that's capital expenditure. Everything else is classified as something called as revenue expenditure. Right now, that's a slightly odd oxymoron kind of a term, but it's called revenue expenditure, which includes everything else. So salary payments, or if you look at pensions, subsidies, interest payments, all of it comes here under revenue expenditure. Now in India, if 100 rupees gets spent, only about 13 to 15 go in capital expenditure. Everything else goes in revenue expenditure. That's not the best kind of expenditure, but social schemes, etc., all run through this. So all the government's expenditure on MNREGA, for example, will go under revenue expenditure, right? Now, if you look at the revenue part, taxes form bulk of the revenue for the government. But in taxes, roughly 50% comes from direct taxes and 50% from indirect taxes. I'll give you the numbers and we'll have a quick discussion around that. And that'll explain some of the things that are going around us as well, right? So if you look at our FY21 budget estimates, right? Again, too many numbers, so don't worry. I'll tell you what numbers you have to focus on. Right at the bottom of the screen, you see this 2.9 trillion was our GDP estimate for 2020. And we are expected to grow to about 3.2 trillion in 2021. That assumed a 10% nominal GDP growth, right? These were the numbers which were presented on 1st of February when the budget came. They revised the estimates for 2020 budget and they gave the estimates for 2021, right? The revised estimate said that we have a total. So when the government collects tax, let me explain the tax bit to you once. So look at this column, third column. The gross tax revenue of the government is 21 lakh crore, 21 trillion rupees, right? Out of this, something goes to states. So about 6 lakh crore or 1/3 goes to states. The remaining 15 lakh crore is with Government of India. That's the number you see here. Tax revenue net to the center is 15 lakh crore. Non-tax revenue is all the dividends that you will find, right? You add these two, that's about 18 lakh crore. That's the expected income. Then you have recovery of loans, 16,000 crore, right? And you have 65,000 crore worth of other receipts, which is disinvestment, right? That comes here. So you add 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's the total revenue you are getting, right? Expenditure is given here. That's 5. If I do 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 and I find the difference with 5, I will have to borrow that amount. That's my borrowing. That's the same as my deficit, fiscal deficit, right? So that's the assumption broadly. Fiscal deficit is 7 lakh crore in India. That's about 3.8% of the GDP. That was the FY20 revised estimate. We were expecting a tax revenue of 15 lakh crore net to the center. Right now things changed because in February is where things started getting impacted. Anyway, we were slowing down. March, we got affected by coronavirus. So things got impacted dramatically at that end, right? So now what came in around May was provisional numbers, right? So you actually came out with what happened in FY20, right? What exactly happened in FY20. So tax revenue fell short by about 1.5 lakh crore. What was expected to be 15 became 13.5, right? Non-tax revenue also slight shortage, disinvestment shortage, right? Expenditure was the same, no change there. There was a minor reduction here, which resulted in your fiscal deficit ballooning. So an extra 2 lakh crore was the shortfall last year. Now that's not all. The problem is the FY21 budget estimates, if you have to achieve them, now assume a 21% growth in your revenue and taxes, nearly a 300% growth in your disinvestment proceeds. That's because the government expected LIC IPO to go through this year. We don't know what will happen there. And a 10% growth in GDP. Now, in reality, you're probably very unlikely to see either of these. Best case scenarios that you see for FY21 are going to see a 10% reduction in the income taxes, in the tax revenue of the government, because one quarter has been washed out altogether. And I'll show you that mathematics as well in a minute, right? I'm assuming doubling of disinvestment proceeds, right? And I'm assuming that real GDP growth for this financial year will be 0%. With 5% inflation, we're looking at still a 5% nominal growth. If real GDP goes down, there's still problem further there. So your fiscal deficit will go to 6%. This has to be borrowed. 13 lakh crore has to be borrowed. Last year, government was borrowing 7 lakh crore. Now they have to borrow 13 lakh crore. How will they borrow this? Right? And when you borrow more as the government, interest rates will go up. Right? Interest rates will go up because there is a finite amount of money in the markets. So if you borrow more, it's going to crowd out other people from borrowing. So that's a problem, right? This is, in my opinion, a conservative estimate, because if you look at this closely, right, the revised estimate for last year, out of this 21 lakh crore, this 6.1 lakh crore was expected to be corporate tax and 5.6 lakh crore was expected to be income tax direct, right? So 11.7. This number for last year fell short by, it came at 10.3. It fell short by about 1.4 lakh crore. Income and corporate tax. Now think of a company that works with sales of 100. It has, let's say, costs of 80. You're working with a profit before tax of 20, on which you are paying a tax of 5, right? So your profit after tax works to 15. Now, if sales dip by 20% in this year, because one quarter is out practically for a lot of the firms, if sales dip by 20% this year, costs will not dip by 20% because some costs are fixed. Costs will probably go to 70, right? So you're making this 10. On 10 your tax goes to 2.5, right? Profit is down. Tax revenue is down minus 50%. And that could be the reality for a lot of sectors and a lot of firms. I'm not even exaggerating in the actual impact. If your tax revenue is down here and you have taken cost reductions, that must have happened at salary as well, because salary is sort of a fixed cost for most businesses. If jobs are going out and salary is going out, then income tax will also suffer. Not only will corporate tax suffer, income tax will also suffer. So I genuinely think this 10% is probably a conservative estimate of what can happen, minus 10%, right? Things can go really wrong here. And which then explains something, that if these two are not happening and transaction is also lower because people are not stepping out, then even GST numbers will be lower for the year. They can't grow, correct? Then what is the only potential estimate that the government has to grow the revenues, right? That's your excise duties. So what you see here, 2.7 lakh crore, 2.67 lakh crore, that's approximately your excise duty on fuel prices. The government is now expecting, by higher excise duties on fuel prices, approximately 4.5 lakh crore for the year, assuming similar consumption, by the way, right? That will itself take a hit. So we can keep shouting as to, why is the government increasing fuel prices and taxes? The reality is there is nothing else they can increase. And they don't want to burden people with corporate tax. They don't want to burden people with income tax. They don't want to burden people with GST. They can't cut any of these either, because there is no income that the government has at this point of time, or very, it's a big dent on the government income. If you think about government income going down from 15 lakh crore, it became 13 lakh crore last year, and that goes to 12 lakh crore. There is a serious dent in terms of the kind of spending the government can do, right? You started this entire discussion with 15 lakh crore of direct tax income and 7 lakh crore of borrowing. Borrowing was half of your tax revenue, right? Now you're ending this discussion at 12 lakh crore of tax income and 13 lakh crore of borrowing. Borrowing is more than your tax income, right? That is a big challenge if you look at how things can play out and how things will work. So I don't think the government has an option but to continue collecting higher excise duty on fuel prices, because the other option is you keep borrowing more, which is a risk of a rating downgrade, right? So unfortunately or fortunately, even though the government might want to spend money in India, unlike Western governments like US or Europe, where there is a huge government spending package that has come in to tackle coronavirus, I don't think India has that kind of a resource pool. So we'll try and make good whatever we have. And that's probably why fuel prices are high. Now, make no mistake, I'm not justifying the action. I'm just saying that I don't think the government is left with too many choices in this context. And so they're choosing the least of the evils that is available that impacts people directly. There is an indirect impact, of course, of higher fuel prices, that your logistics cost goes up, so automatically translates into inflation in the entire economy. That's true. But what else can they do? If they change the tax rates, that's going to be a direct impact, and they don't want to do that at this point. They wouldn't want to do that at this point when people are not really getting their jobs as well. So understand that there is a sort of a mix and match in these policy things that play out. And that's extremely relevant. In fact, if you look at some of the reports, direct tax collections have fallen. That to 10.3 lakh crore number I was giving, this is the first drop in 2 decades in India, right? And that's a big challenge from 11.7 lakh crore if this declines year on year, right? Because then the next year is also likely to be a decline, right? And evidence of the first quarter, April to June, is that your tax collected stood at 92,000 crore as against 1.3 lakh crore last year, right? So shortfall is already 33% this year on the tax collected by June mid, which is where the first your advanced tax collections happen in India, right? So there is a big challenge that the government faces at this point in terms of these fiscal scenarios and these fiscal policies. And that's unfortunately the reality at this point of time. Now, if you ask my personal opinion, I think the government should say that rating agencies can, be ignored at this point of time, and we should borrow and we should spend, right? Of course, you have to have a balance there, but this is a sort of a once in 100 years kind of an event that's happening around us. It's important that we don't go too cautious here. It's important to put money in the hands of people, and that will increase the fiscal deficit. So we should ignore this number altogether for this year. All governments are doing it. So I think the rating agencies should be sensible enough to understand that it's a global phenomenon, right? Of course, there's an impact of that in the longer run, but that's what the government is trying to do. So let's see how impacts play out. I think things will become clearer in the next few months as we kind of look at some of this data. Right. So that's basically it from me in terms of my broader discussion that I wanted to have with you guys. That's it from me. I'm open to any kind of questions that we have at this point of time now. Let me stop sharing. Yep. Questions. You can unmute yourself and probably put questions that are there.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Okay, so first of all, I'd like to introduce myself that I'm Nehal Panchal from PGDM course, and
Okay.
my specialization is finance.
Mhm.
So my question is that today early morning I read one of the article that is how work from home will be, more productive towards our economy. And first of all, there are many opportunities as well as challenges abound in this new work from home economy. So what do you think that working from home will be major long-term economic, productivity, or it may be a disadvantage? Because nowadays the we generations are like more, skillful towards the showcasing our like skills, like going out. And do you think that working from home will be more advantage towards this, or it will be drawback?
So Nihal, I think good question, and obviously a very pertinent question in today's day and age.
Yeah,
There are
thank
various ways to look at it. There are two aspects to this. One is basically the immediate impact in terms of, let's say, economic costs there. So work from home India has had a sort of a time to kind of develop its cities, but fortunately or unfortunately, we've not been able to do that. Practically, most of the careers in India in the urban segment exist in about 10 cities. And so consequently, these cities are densely populated. Because of that, what happens is travel time becomes very large in a lot of these cities. So the first economic benefit you get out of work from home is you kind of save on immense amount of time. I mean, take Bombay, for example. On average, a person would be traveling 1.5 to 2 hours a day, combining both sides of, to work and from work. You save that straight away. Add to that the benefit of, saving the tiredness you have, mental stress that you have, etc., that in traveling, and the fuel cost, etc. The economic advantages of that are immense on the user side, on the, employee side. Now think of it from the corporate side. A large corporate like TCS says 75% of their workforce is working from home, and they say that in 5 years that will become the norm, right? Now TCS has 4 lakh employees. They can practically increase that number to 16 lakhs now if 75% of their workforce is going to work from home without any additional investment in real estate. Right? There is no capacity needed, no rent needed, but you can basically say the next 12 lakh employees are going to work from home, right? For all practical purposes. So from productivity point of view, that increases dramatically as well. So that's the positive side on that. That obviously has an impact on variety of other things, negative impact on commercial real estate, I think. Positive impact on commercial real estate in tier 2 cities, because if I'm working from home, I can work from a tier 2 town. Rather than sitting in Mumbai at a higher real estate price in the first place. So there is sort of a migration of value that could happen in real estate from densely populated cities to less densely populated cities, and that could be the trigger in terms of development of the next 50 cities in India. Ideally the government should have done it over the last 50-60 years, but we didn't do that. and states were kind of focusing more on I don't know what, but basically we are left with about 8-10 cities which have all career opportunities, and everyone from all the other cities basically migrates to these cities every year, right? And I think 8-10 is also an overstatement. If you look at IT, that's practically 3 cities, right?
Yes.
Broadly, Bangalore, Hyderabad, and Gurgaon, right? If you look at finance, that's practically 1 or 2 cities, right? So, I mean, you're looking at about significant change in trends there. Now, there is a negative of that as well, which I think is more on the behavioral side, and we don't understand it as yet, right? People are outgoing by nature, and human nature has been created over, you know, centuries. So you can't suddenly just reverse that in 1 year and say, sit in your home and keep doing this work. I'm reasonably certain that almost all of us are now bored of sitting at home, and mentally that takes a lot of stress. I mean, how long can you continue working in a room talking like this? At some
Yes,
point you will
exactly.
want to go and meet people. Now I think at some point we will have a mix of both of these, so people will be required to come to offices but not on all days probably, and
Yeah.
that could become the new normal. I think there are more advantages in a country like India than disadvantages. I
Yes.
genuinely think that will help real estate prices correct a little bit, which is a need in India for more development to happen. Genuinely think travel time will get reduced, which in the absence of infrastructure, it's very difficult to change something like that in a short period in Mumbai. I think female participation in the labor force will increase dramatically because work from home then gives that opportunity to a lot of women who were otherwise not being able to join the workforce for a variety of other responsibilities, or the way society is kind of there in India. That is a big advantage. Historically, we've practically not been able to deploy a large part of our deployable workforce just because of how society works in India, and that could be a big advantage because of work from home. So I think it's not something that we can look at an immediate economic benefit aspect of it. I think the longer term economic benefits of working from home outweigh the problems. uh, the challenge we have is, I think, on the social interaction bit, which I think is important. For example, I think schools, at least in a primary stage, it is very difficult to run a school on an online model. There is no engagement that kids have at all,
Yes, exactly.
right? So I think there are
Yeah.
pluses and minuses, but on balance, it should be a good thing to happen worldwide.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for sharing this. Thank you.
Sure, Neil. Questions, guys? What other questions do we have?
So Yash here from PGDM.
Yes, yes.
Hello?
Go ahead. Yeah. Please ask a question.
Yeah, I just had one question. It was like most of the cities are the only part which are infected by this coronavirus, but rural economy is still in quite better shape. And as we know, the data released, like they said, India is having abundant of agricultural product availability. Means so in long run, that was not much affected the agriculture sector for this economic coronavirus. So rural economy is shooting. People are migrating back to the tier 2, tier 3 cities. So obviously, so I think that there would just be a change that uh, tier 1 cities would be on the downgrade side, and economy will continue to shoot by this rural economy.
So true. I think rural economy continues to do well, but I think a lot of the migration in India that happened was more by force, right? I mean, people didn't have enough relevant jobs in rural India. That's why they migrated to cities, right? Otherwise, why would they migrate to cities in the first place? Now, if
Yeah,
we have enough,
despite being India agricultural means sector means more focuses on agriculture sector, we still see you can see any balance sheet of an agricultural sector company. They always mention that we have a productivity shortfall due to lack of workforce. So how means this could be also be resolved. So
See, I sense there is a problem there in terms of what we think this entire setup, purely because if you think about how much is agriculture as a percentage of India's GDP? Any idea?
not proper. I don't have those numbers.
15%, 15. And how much population is workforce is deployed in agriculture? That's about 50%. So out of 100 people working in India, 50 work in agriculture. But out of 100 rupees of GDP in India, 15 comes out of agriculture. So it's clearly an unproductive segment in that context. If you put more people out of the 100 into that, that's not going to change things. In fact, the whole reason there is urbanization and people are moving towards these cities is that agriculture is highly inefficient in India. So we will keep reading narratives like rural economy is doing well and all. That's a lot to do with what is already there. But if someone who was working in the city goes back to rural India, will there be an relevant job for this person is something that we have to think about, right? There is already like half of India's workforce in rural India, and we are generating only 15% of the output. So there is something wrong there over these years. So either that output has to increase dramatically, or the workforce has to reduce there. There are better roles that are available.
But the agricultural sector company, they state that their output has been affecting due to non-availability of the skilled labor.
That's still going to be the place, right? How are you going to skill someone who was working on a construction site to go and work in an agricultural sector company? And where are these companies basically?
You can see that coffee and tea plantation in Tamil Nadu and Assam. Then there are in Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh, we have the grain fields. So if
the question you need to ask is, why do people not work there?
Yes.
Why do you think they don't work there? If there was a job available there and it was a well-paying job, why wouldn't people work there? It's probably not as well-paying as a job in the city. That's why people migrate to cities, right? And that's the exact issue that I don't think it's by choice that people choose to come to a city and live in the conditions they live in and work in an informal segment in the city. It's basically because back home there aren't enough well-paying opportunities available. The amount of pay you get in those segments is probably significantly lesser. So unless we change something dramatically there, and the companies in those segments can't pay because the output is not enough. So unless those companies double, triple in size, they are not going to pay more. If they're not going to pay more, you're only going to utilize more of your workforce to generate less of the output. That's not going to help. So I think we need a lot more jobs in the knowledge sector and manufacturing sector over the next few years. Something we've been trying to do, but we have not been able to kind of utilize, to be honest. So hopefully in the next 5 years, we'll be forced to do that given what's happening. And that's where we are. But
this current scenario can meet that gap now, because anyways, those are now unemployed. So they would be like okay to do that work.
And then when the city opens up, do you think they'll continue working there or they'll come back to the city?
Now that is a very tricky question, because now as we can see, city everyone knows that now rural economy is going to drive us forward. So it would be wiser to stay.
So let's see if we find that if rural economy drives us. Rural economy, agriculture is 15% of our GDP. How does that support all the population that goes back to villages? We'll have to see.
Yeah, but also the opportunities which are coming to in India, and mostly now they are not targeting towards they are not willing to set up like Uttar Pradesh. We know that they had bagged many much manufacturing companies in there. So cities would be less or crowded than now rural economy, I think.
let's see. Hopefully that should play out.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions, guys?
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Jyoti from PGDM batch.
Yeah,
Sir,
Jyoti.
I have read one of the Uday Kotak's article and
Mhm.
it was about the banking sector. So
Okay.
what are your insights about banking sector in terms of capital positioning? Because if we see banking sector's loan book is about 100 lakh crore
Mhm.
and the total capital is about 11 to 12 lakh crores. So
Mhm.
how you see this and what are your insights on this?
So I think that's the way a bank works basically. The capital to loans ratio is what is called as your capital adequacy ratio, and that by norm is expected to be 9%. And some banks have it better than the others. I don't think from a capital position, Indian private banks have a problem. PSU banks have a problem. That's a different and known story any which ways. Uh, I think purely from a broader growth story, India is underserved on the lending segment. Our capital or loans to credit to GDP ratio is approximately 50%. That could be significantly higher, right? The word average is around 80, 90, 100%. So we could easily go there. And without that credit availability, I think growth gets constricted dramatically. So in terms of a broader 10-year story, I think nothing changes in the banking setup. In the short run, of course, there could be some sort of a hiccup in terms of non-performing assets that creep up because of these slowdowns or shutdowns that we are facing due to coronavirus. But that again remains to be seen in terms of how much of that impact would play out and how long this continues. At this point, nobody knows the extent of the damage that is going to happen. We're all conjecturing that it'll take 3 months or 6 months or 12 months. Nobody knows exactly how much time it is going to take. So that's why the moratorium has been given on a lot of the loans. But will those loans actually translate into NPAs is a big, it's dependent on the fact that how quickly can we restart the economy. So if we can restart the economy in the next 3 months, then hopefully things should again fall back in place and things should start moving up. If we are not able to restart the economy, then there could be tad bit of challenges that kind of crop up in terms of the loans that the banking sector has given out specifically to retail individuals and MSMEs. Those segments could be under severe stress. So I think that remains to be seen. Private banks are better placed in India in general in terms of their loan book. But if a problem starts, then I think nobody is aloof in the banking segment. Everybody suffers.
Okay. Thank you.
Right now, too little data to honestly suggest that things can go bad.
Okay. Thank you, sir, for your insights.
Sure, Jyoti. Thanks.
Good morning, Mr. Piyush. This is Professor Namrata here.
Good morning, ma'am.
One question to you with respect to credit which is going around in our country. So, what is your take on the different kinds of loans or moratoriums which are given? I just want to know, do you see them getting converted into NPA in the next year or so? And what percentage are you seeing it to become an NPA?
So I honestly don't have a complete sense on it because right now all those numbers will not be reported as an NPA. And in fact, RBI has now come up with this idea that for the entire year FY21, they are going to probably allow banks to not classify this as. So they're allowing that one-time restructuring of these loans. So what will happen is the NPA problem, if it happens, is going to come in sometime in the future. Now, my sense is there are certain segments that are definitely at risk. So, for example, in your retail individual loans, a lot of India's this car boom in terms of the commercial services of cabs was fueled by auto loan related segments. Essentially, cabs bought on loans and then being driven by drivers for Uber and Ola and all that. It may not be a very large segment, but that's a segment that is likely to get affected immediately. And you'll probably see the numbers getting bad there. The only saving grace is there is a collateral there, and the car can get sold. But that doesn't mean the economic hardship stops there. It does create a little bit of a problem, and that tap of at least a segment of people who are taking that credit and running a business out of that is going to stop for the near future. That's one segment that's a problem. I think globally we are seeing a phenomenon of education loans being under stress. So that could be a challenge as well. That could result in education loans being a problem as well.
So just one last thing, since you talked about consumer loans, I think we've seen that the real estate has been in a slump for the last few years. And I don't see any traction in the real estate sector in the coming year or two. So
Correct.
what about the housing loans? Because there are so many builders who are now filing for bankruptcy. So what is
There
your
could
take
be a
on
problem.
housing loans?
There could be a problem in terms of housing loans as well, especially in places like MMR, Mumbai and Delhi, because the ticket size is very large. And if the project doesn't get completed and you're supposed to repay that loan without the asset in your hands, that's going to be a big problem in the first place. The second problem is, if people lose their jobs, then what happens? So I think the challenge that happens is a direct issue on real estate prices, because if I was paying an EMI in a place like Mumbai and my salary gets cut or I kind of lose my job,
Right.
that basically creates a little bit of a challenge in terms of the real estate prices. Now, if real estate prices go out, that takes developers with it, because developers were betting on basically making good those loans by selling those units and higher prices. That's not going to work. So I think real estate is a segment that is in a mess, and it needs to see lower prices for it to resolve itself. I don't think developers understand that at this point of time, or believe that. They believe that somehow something will come out and save them. But I don't think that is going to happen without cutting the prices in the real estate segment. Home loans is a segment that could be under stress. Once again, I think the good part in India, at least for a large chunk of home loans, is that loan to value ratio is never more than 80%. So unless the housing price goes down by 20%, that's basically an asset that is not necessarily so bad, even for the bank, if it eventually comes on their books. Second thing, at least in the, if you leave out the last 4 or 5 years, in bulk parts of India, while loan to value ratio was 80%, banks never gave that much loan. So if a house was worth 1 crore, 2-3 things happened which are good and bad. Good because they save us in this kind of a time from a banking system collapse. Bad because it involved usage of black money. So if you go out of the top few cities in India, and I'm assuming even the top cities that would work, or that used to work at least a few years ago, part payment used to happen with cash, right? So if the property is worth 1 crore and 20 lakh is paid as cash, then out of 80 lakhs you have taken 60 lakhs as loan from the bank, approximately 75% loan to value ratio. Unless the price goes from 1 crore to 60 lakh, the loan technically does not go bad, right? Unlike Western countries where loan to value ratio could be 95%, where a 5% dip in the price basically makes the person think that, why should I repay the loan? Let me just default on it, right? That situation is a little bit far. I think in certain cities that could be a problem, but hopefully should be isolated and should not be a banking sector specific problem. It would be a problem for the real estate sector, undoubtedly.
One biggest question, see, whatever you said, I completely agree with that. And thank you for such a beautiful explanation for all the students. Just one thought, in India, do you think the value of the property is apt? Or who decides the value as such in real estate?
So in almost all asset classes, the value is a factor of what the buyer is willing to pay and what the seller is willing to accept. I mean, it's the same for gold. It's the same for, copper. It's the same for stocks as well, to be honest. Right. So I think from that perspective, I don't think the value is correct. That's at least my personal opinion. It could, It could change, but unless it goes down, I can't see the way, real estate transactions pick up. I think if I'm not wrong, in Mumbai, it's already down 20%, just that people are not willing to accept it.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Piyush. I think that was very much necessary for the students to understand how assets gets valued in, for different asset classes, and very aptly put by you. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, so I think we have come to the end of the session. Piyush, as usual, I think it was really enriching because you have opened the eyes of these students to some of these important trends that people have to take care of. They have to be aware of, and they'll have to be sensitive towards it, because
Sure.
given the way in which the careers are going to reshape themselves in the near future, I think it is always useful to know about the actual realities, even if they may be a little harsh, knowing about it and then trying to combat the challenges which are likely to come in the near future. I think we are definitely going to look forward to another session from you, wherein how is it that we should cope up with some of these challenges? Those methods can be talked about. How is it that
Sure.
the careers have to take shape? We
Sure.
are planning a career insights session very soon, and
Sure.
we are sure to invite you once again, because your holistic picture, your comprehensive view was extremely helpful. Thank you
Thank
very
you, ma'am.
much for this session. Thank
If
you.
I can take 1 minute, I'll just have a quick
Please.
word of advice for students, because I get a lot of these questions these days in
Right.
our work with various campuses and colleges and students, is what do we do in this year, right? So everyone in PGP, PGDM year 2, basically, you guys are like in the eye of the storm, slightly lesser than the guys who just passed out, who were like right in the middle of it and caught unaware. They didn't have any escape, right? You guys still have a year, and hopefully things should kind of peter out over that period. So don't worry too much about it, right? In terms of stress, take stress on things that are in your control. This is not in your control. So focus on adding to your skills, focus on ensuring that as and when the economy opens up, opportunities open up, you're ready to lap it up, right? That's part one. Part two is we can't wish away the crisis. It is there. It's always good to remember that if you have the choice of facing the crisis, it's good to face it early in your career, because you have a lot of opportunity to pivot at this point of time. You can change your skill set, you can add to your skill set and move. I passed out of my MBA in 2004. Imagine if one of my batchmates or me lose our job at this point of time. We have very little, mechanism to actually add to our skill set and move and pivot at this point. So if ever you have to face a crisis, it's always better to face it early in your career. Those would be my 2 words, ma'am. I think I've overshot the time. Thanks a lot for inviting me. It was a pleasure interacting. Look forward to future sessions as well. Students can feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. You can search Piyush Chitlangia on LinkedIn. You'll find me there, and more than glad to address any queries that people might have. Thanks a lot, ma'am, once again for this opportunity. Would be great to come again and do some session.
Yeah. The pleasure was all ours. I must say that.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Logging off.